In this, our fourth lecture, we come now to the namesake for our study center. So allow me to provide a bit of biographical information before we look at Arthur Perkins' role in the battle for orthodoxy. Arthur Perkins was born in 1887 in Appleton, Wisconsin. His father, Jared Seymour, and his mother, Jenny, enjoyed a comfortable middle-class existence. Arthur was the eldest of three children. His brother, Ray Bruce Perkins, died at 16 months of age. His sister, Elnora, lived her adult life in Oregon. J.S., as Arthur's father was called, moved his family to Maple Valley, Wisconsin, shortly after the turn of the century. And this represented a change in occupation as J.S. now took up farming. Arthur was a natural in agriculture, and by the age of 17, he owned and operated two successful farms. In 1910, Arthur married Marie Harreau, and together they had 5 children, the youngest of whom died in a miscarriage. The turning point in Arthur's life came in 1915 at the Hickory United Methodist Church in Hickory Corners, Wisconsin. That church held a revival where the good news was preached. Arthur was in attendance, and the Lord used the gospel to transform this man. Soon after his conversion, Art sensed a call to the ministry. He dedicated himself to telling other beggars where they could find bread. Arthur's early experiences in ministry came in the Methodist Church. Sensing a need for more theological training, the Perkins family moved to Chicago, and Art took up studies at the Moody Bible Institute in 1917. During this time, oddly enough, Perkins became a convinced Presbyterian. After serving an internship at the Presbyterian Church in Wausau, Wisconsin, Perkins came under the care of the Winnebago Presbytery of the PCUSA. Now, Winnebago had been an old school presbytery which covered the north central and northeastern parts of the state. In 1922, Arthur Perkins was ordained by the Winnebago Presbytery, and soon afterward he was called to serve the North Milwaukee Presbyterian Church and the nearby West Granville Presbyterian Church. The Wisconsin Presbyterian, a periodical put out by the PCUSA, reported this news, saying, "The presbytery, Winnebago, is loath to let Perkins go, having found in him a man of faith and great willingness to work in the church. The prayers and best wishes of his brethren of the presbytery go with him as he takes up the work." The people of North Milwaukee were not at all disappointed in their new pastor. His dedication to evangelism led to steady growth within his own congregation as well as around the state. Again, the Wisconsin Presbyterian took notice. It reported, Reverend Arthur Perkins, pastor of North Milwaukee Church, held a 2-week series of meetings in the Coudray Church with blessed results. The attendance and interest were large from the start, and the power of God was early manifest in the services. 29 members were received into membership at the close, most of them by confession of faith and baptism. The entire community has been richly blessed, and we wish it were possible for Reverend Perkins to conduct similar services in many of our fields. After almost 4 years of fruitful ministry in Milwaukee, Perkins was called back to the Winnebago Presbytery to serve as their field director. In this role, he was responsible for small and struggling rural churches, as well as starting new congregations. He would be the rough equivalent of an OPC regional home missionary. It was significant that all the pastors of the large and established churches of Winnebago Presbytery were openly supportive of his call. There was no dissent in bringing him to serve their presbytery in this capacity. Over the next 4 years, Perkins worked tirelessly to strengthen the rural churches of Winnebago. He traveled incessantly, often visiting seminaries in search of ministerial candidates to fill openings in the presbytery. He reported annually to the presbytery and to the Synod of Wisconsin. He was frequently commended for his industry and his successful management. He was both efficient and evangelistic, and no one faulted him for either. His innovative approaches helped the rural pastors and their wives. Perkins was ahead of his time in numerous respects. No one had a bad word to say against him, and God blessed his work greatly. He was recognized as the best field director that Winnebago Presbytery had ever seen. At one point, he was unanimously elected to serve as the moderator of the presbytery. All was well, and everyone was happy, or so it looked on the surface. On June 20, 1929, the Winnebago Presbytery held a pro-Renata meeting in the small town of Weyauwega, Wisconsin. There were 6 presbyters in attendance that day, including field director Arthur Perkins. The reason for the meeting was to examine a candidate for ordination. Mr. Lewis Lutz had graduated from the McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago, and the presbytery's intent was to ordain Lutz that same evening. During his ordination exams, Lutz was asked whether he believed in the virgin birth of Christ. Lutz answered in the negative. No, he did not. At this, Perkins' ears perked up. After being recognized by the chair, Perkins asked Lutz who he believed to be the father of Jesus. And Lutz responded, Joseph. Perkins turned to his Westminster Confession of Faith, and reading from chapter 8, paragraph 2, he sought a response from the candidate. Could the candidate agree with the statement of the confession? Lutz's response left no doubt whatsoever. He said, if I have to acquiesce to that or not be ordained, I won't be ordained. Lutz was immediately informed by his examiner, the Dr. A.W. Rabe, that you don't have to acquiesce. When the vote was taken, one presbyter voted against Lewis Lutz, and that no vote was Arthur Perkins. Perkins would later challenge Rabe publicly over his controversial assurance that Lutz didn't need to affirm the virgin birth of Christ. Rabe and the other modernists of Winnebago would not forget Perkins' stance against them that day. The war had come and Perkins was engaged. Life went on as usual for several years after. Perkins continued to produce high-level results as the field director, as his annual reports demonstrate. Between recruiting trips to seminaries, session meetings, revivals, evangelistic outreaches, and conferences, he was busy about the work of God's kingdom. In the background, however, unnoticed by most, a shift was taking place. The balance between modernists and fundamentalists was changing. Liberal unbelief was gaining the upper hand, and fundamentalism was not keeping pace. The key event in Perkins' battle against modernism took place on the shores of Crescent Lake near Rhinelander, Wisconsin. Arthur and Marie had a cabin on Crescent Lake, and for years they had enjoyed the peace and the tranquility of their cabin. Arthur had brought teenage boys to the cabin for retreats, which had been spiritually successful. When Arthur heard that a piece of lakefront property was available for a very affordable price, he called his colleague Ernest Tremblay. And on December 14, 1933, they met at the property to consider the possibilities. They dreamed of a summer camp where young people could hear the clear gospel of Jesus Christ proclaimed from the Scriptures. No modernist unbelief would be tolerated by Perkins or by Tremblay. Believing that God had opened a door of opportunity, these brothers in arms each pledged $5 toward the down payment on the property. And that day, the Crescent Lake Bible Camp was born. With the help of like-minded friends and supporters, money was collected to pay the purchase price of $400. So in the spring of 1934, plans were made to clear the land and to begin construction of the first buildings. The hope was to hold meetings at the camp in July of that year. Through the ambitious leadership of Arthur Perkins, this dream became a reality. Perhaps anticipating resistance from the Winnebago Presbytery, Perkins and the board of CLBC determined to register with the state of Wisconsin as a private camp. They were not a Presbyterian camp, and they did not organize under the auspices of the PCUSA. They did not seek permission from the Winnebago Presbytery to start their camp, nor did they need to do so. Winnebago had no jurisdiction over the Crescent Lake Bible Camp. What took place in the spring meeting of the Winnebago Presbytery came as a great surprise. Convening in Oshkosh on April 10, 1934, the Presbytery handled 2 items of business related to Arthur Perkins. He finished his 7th and final year of service as the field director, and he gave his final report. He was also approved to become the full-time pastor of the Merrill Presbyterian Church. Though all of that was expected, there was also a surprise. A special judicial committee brought a report related to the Crescent Lake Bible Camp. At his trial the next year, Perkins said this: "There had been no previous act placing this in the hands of the judicial committee to my knowledge, and I think I would have known if there had been such an act." This matter appeared out of thin air, but the results were not insignificant. Again, testifying at his trial, Perkins observed another oddity in these proceedings. The Presbytery made no investigation concerning the project before condemning it, and the Presbytery nor a committee never sought to ascertain how far the project had gone before they condemned it. In the deliberations that followed, a resolution was put forward asserting that the Crescent Lake project was inherently divisive and that no minister or elder from the Presbytery should support this camp. Now, this was clearly aimed at Arthur Perkins. When he was asked if he would renounce his involvement in the camp, he stated publicly that if it could be proven that the camp and the organization were, quote, unchristian, illegal, and unpresbyterian, he would stop and desist, end quote. Now, no efforts had been made to prove that the Crescent Lake Project was any or all of these things. Perkins' conditions were not met, and so he refused to desist from supporting this effort. The rationale of the modernists ran as follows. The presbytery has conducted summer camps for young people at Green Lake and at Cheddock. They also had hopes of starting a camp at Archibald Lake, about an hour and a half to the southeast of Rhinelander. Hence, the Crescent Lake camp would present competition to the existing camps and to the proposed Archibald Lake camp. When the matter came to a vote, 32 voted in favor and 22 voted against it. The modernists now controlled Winnebago Presbytery by a clear majority. At this juncture, an interesting sleight of hand was introduced. The original motion read, because of the inevitable tendency of this project, we would recommend that all officers and subscribers to this enterprise desist at once in such promotion, either as a Presbyterial movement or as a private camp for Presbyterian young people. Now, according to the modernists who are driving this effort, once the presbytery voted in favor of the motion, the recommendation now became a requirement. All members of the presbytery were now forbidden from supporting CLBC according to their interpretation of the motion. But there are two serious problems with this sleight of hand. First of all, Perkins and his friends took the motion to be a pious recommendation, not a binding rule. They believed that they had liberty of conscience to ignore the recommendation and to continue supporting the camp. The second problem was that they were disallowed from promoting CLBC as a Presbyterial movement or as a private camp for Presbyterian young people. But Perkins had never advertised CLBC as a Presbyterian camp, nor did they ever restrict campers to only or even mainly Presbyterian young people. And so logically, they were free to continue supporting this non-denominational Christian camp. After the presbytery adjourned that day, the CLBC board met to discuss what had just happened. After discussion, they composed a letter to the presbytery, politely reminding the body that they lacked jurisdiction to impose such restraints on the supporters of the Crescent Lake camp. The board stated that they judged Mr. Perkins to be, quote, ethically free to continue his position in the Crescent Lake Bible Fellowship, end quote. That summer saw the inauguration of the Crescent Lake Bible Camp. The experience delighted everyone, but especially Arthur Perkins. His dream had come true. But not everyone was so enthused. The modernists saw the efforts at Crescent Lake as, quote, quite unwise, unethical, and divisive, as well as positively contrary to our vows as presbyters looking to the peace, unity, and purity of the church, end quote. In other words, by refusing the recommendation of the presbytery, the supporters of CLBC had committed chargeable offenses in the eyes of the modernists. In addition to the percolating problems of Crescent Lake, Arthur Perkins became embroiled in another situation that proved equally contentious. The Presbyterian congregation in Stratford, Wisconsin, was disinclined to follow modernist thought and practice. In fact, they wanted to leave the denomination and take their building with them. Through some questionable procedures, they sought to retain their property. At that time, all church buildings were the property of the presbytery. So if a congregation chose to leave the denomination, the presbytery would retain ownership of the building. Though Art was not supportive of these financial shenanigans, he was sympathetic to their concerns about modernism. He had moderated their session and had influence in the church. When the presbytery got wind of the desire of the Stratford congregation to leave, they sent a delegation to talk to the leaders of the church. Perkins was included in that meeting between the representatives of the presbytery and the leadership there in Stratford. That meeting went sideways in a hurry, with various threats being made against the presbytery representatives. Although he was not to blame for the dynamics of the meeting, this became another avenue for the modernists to attack Arthur Perkins. At the Winnebago Presbytery meeting that October, the committee submitted a report on the Stratford situation that was sharply critical of Perkins. This report, in conjunction with the Crescent Lake camp matter, became the backbone of the charges brought against Arthur Perkins. In April 1935, the judicial process was formally instituted against Reverend Perkins, with a trial scheduled for July of that year. The trial began on July 9, and it lasted for several weeks. Perkins' team was given 2 days to make their defense. The prosecution consumed almost half of the time allotted to the defense by cross-examination and various objections to the proceedings. Perkins himself took the stand where he was badgered by his nemesis, the Reverend Marshall Olson. The treatment that Perkins received at Olson's hands contributed to his later breakdown of mind and body. The outcome of the trial was not particularly surprising. Perkins was convicted and he was censured. He appealed first to the Synod of Wisconsin, which upheld his conviction but reduced his censure. He then appealed to the General Assembly, which was to meet the following May in Syracuse, New York. The Syracuse Assembly eventually upheld the convictions of the various appellants, including Machen, DeWard, and Perkins. And in Perkins' case, they actually increased the censure to a level which was virtually unattainable. Leaving Syracuse, Perkins and his traveling companions made their way to Philadelphia to attend the first General Assembly of the new denomination, which would become the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. Upon the completion of that glorious meeting in Philadelphia, Perkins drove back to Wisconsin in time to attend the Winnebago Presbytery meeting where his suspension was announced and enforced. Perkins renounced the jurisdiction of the PCUSA, choosing to identify with the new church, which continued the heritage of his old church. For his courageous stand against modernism and his fight to maintain orthodoxy, Arthur Perkins paid a heavy price. In September 1936, he suffered a mental and emotional breakdown. His wife was distressed. She did not know how to help her husband. He became a resident at the Still Hildreth Sanatorium in Macon, Missouri for almost 2 months. Experiencing no real improvement in his condition and running out of money to pay for the care, he was then taken to the Mendota State Mental Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin. After a week under their care, his great heart gave out and he died. He gave his life for the sake of Christ, a true martyr witnessing to his Savior. From the moment that he voted against Louis Lutz, Arthur Perkins had many opportunities to cut his losses, to abandon his stand for orthodoxy. The longer he remained in the fight, the greater the cost to him and to his family and to his church. And yet the truth of the gospel mattered more to him than did his own comfort and ease. For Perkins, the battle was always bigger than his own personal circumstances. He counted the cost and he paid the price for truth willingly. And though it appeared that he had lost everything, he actually gained far more. A clear and good conscience, and those blessed words, "Well done, good and faithful servant, enter into your master's happiness." I close with a statement that was contained in a letter written to Dr. J. Gresham Machen on May 11, 1936. Perkins and Machen kept up a very heavy correspondence for about a year and a half. But this is the gem of all of those letters. He writes, "I thank God for the high privilege of being allowed by His grace to live today and to stand out here against force and tyranny." Perkins saw his own experiences of force and tyranny as a high privilege given to him by his God. He was allowed by God's grace to fight for orthodoxy and to fight against modernism. And even the eventual sacrifice of his health, his strength, and even of his sanity, it was all worthwhile for the privilege of serving Jesus Christ, his Lord and King. Thank you.